afternoon, good evening, or good morning, depending on where you're joining us. And welcome to today's Norms and Behavioral Change Talk. My name is Samira Sayed, and I'm the Managing Director of the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics here at the University of Pennsylvania. We have a really interesting agenda for you here today, starting with a brief talk by an early career researcher, Dr. Ahra from the University of Pennsylvania, followed by the main talk by Professor Ryan Muldoon from the University at Buffalo. After these two talks, we'll have a Q&A segment open to all participants towards the end of today's session. And for those of you who might be joining us for the first time, the NoBeC talks, or the Norms and Behavioral Change Talks, are organized by the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics here at Penn, with the support of the Philosophy, Politics, and Economics program, and in partnership with the Master of Behavioral and Decision Sciences program. The center itself is a research center which provides specialized consulting, research, and training services to organizations throughout the world seeking to enact positive behavioral change. And now here you can see the schedule of NoBeC talks that we have lined up through the rest of 2024. You can visit our website to register and to see further details on these upcoming talks. And what I mentioned each time we have one of these NoBeC talks is that we are very much in the planning stages for a Norms and Behavioral Change Conference to be taking place in October of this year. So stay tuned, and we'll be sending out more information, save the dates, etc., in due course. And just before we get started, just a couple of ground rules we wanted to share. You should automatically be muted, but while the speakers are presenting, we kindly ask that you mute yourself. If possible, please do keep your camera on so that we can have a more interactive conversation today. For any questions, please use the chat at any time, or at the very end when we have a Q&A, feel free to raise your hand. And then lastly, the recordings of these sessions will be uploaded both to our website and on YouTube as well. And so with that, I'll go ahead and turn to our first speaker. Our first presentation is by an early career researcher, Dr. Ahra. Ahra is a research project manager for the Behavior Change for Good initiative at the University of Pennsylvania, where she manages the execution of the initiative's large-scale field studies on behavioral change. Ahra received her PhD in social psychology from Arizona State University. Let me just stop sharing my screen so that Ahra, you can go ahead and present. And while you do that, I can share with everyone that Ahra's presentation today is on the following: Family Matters, a cross-cultural analysis of social motives in 42 countries. And so with that, I'll hand it over to you, Ahra, and thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, my name is Ahra at the Behavior Change for Good initiative. What are the social challenges you have faced regularly in your life? Perhaps you might think often about building and maintaining strong relationships, caring for your family and loved ones, and especially over the last few years, avoiding infectious diseases. All humans have faced these social challenges repeatedly throughout history. To navigate these challenges, humans are presumed to have evolved a set of fundamental social motives, such as protecting oneself from dangerous others and people who carry infectious diseases, building and maintaining friendships, acquiring social respect, finding and attracting romantic sexual relationships, maintaining those relationships, and caring for family and children. Among these fundamental social goals, how do you rank them in your own life from the most important to the least important? Which is the most important to you? Now, how do you think people living on the other side of the planet, such as Korean, would answer the question? Do you think they'd prioritize the goals in the same way as you or in a different way? All of these goals are fascinating psychology topics, but for today's talk, we will focus on the goals related to the sexual attraction and goals linked to family bond. When Americans were asked to rank these goals, most participants chose the goals linked to family bonds as the most important to them. Should we be surprised by this? Probably not, because there are ample theoretical reasons why family bonds are so important to humans. First, by themselves, human children, including my daughter, are pretty incompetent. They are not able to produce or find the calories they need until adulthood. Second, of all the great apes, we are the only one that form long-term committed pair bonding relationship. Third, unlike 95% of mammalian species, men invest a ton of time and energy in their children. Finally, women are unique among female mammals in that they live for decades after they are no longer able to have children, providing resources and care to their grandchildren. For these reasons, it should be no surprise that family is important to Americans. Then how about people living on the other side of the planet? For this international project, we asked how much they agree on the fundamental social motive inventory like this that contains 66 items. Aggregating from all participants from 42 countries, we found that people around the world were more strongly motivated to take care of their family members, including their significant other, than any other goals. Does this pattern hold for all 42 countries? Comparing the mate-seeking goal, red, and blue family bonds goals, the pattern holds for countries in North America, Latin America, Asia, Europe, Africa, and Oceania. So yes, the pattern holds for all 42 countries. We also found that both men and women are highly motivated to take care of their family, and across age, even for single people, including college-age students, family bonds motivation were viewed as substantially more important than mate-seeking motivation. It's fascinating that people from all 42 countries, some not often studied in Western psychology, prioritize family relationships, regardless of gender, relationship status, and age. I believe there are so many unexplored questions remaining to be asked and answered within the centrality important domain. Academic family matters too. I like to thank my PIs. And if you're curious, you can read more about this finding in the perspectives on psychology science. And the data is publicly available through the scientific data. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ahra, for this really compelling piece of work. Let me just go ahead and share my screen once more as we move forward. But that was just to say, again, thank you so much, Ahra, and to everyone here in the meeting, feel free to place any questions that you might have for Ahra in the chat, and we'll have a Q&A segment towards the end of today's session. But in the meantime, we can continue moving forward to today's main talk, which will be by Professor Ryan Muldoon. Ryan is an associate professor of philosophy and the director of the Philosophy, Politics, and Economics program at the University at Buffalo. His work focuses on diversity and dynamism in political philosophy and the dynamics of social norms. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen so that, Ryan, you can go ahead and share. And as you do that, I'll share with everyone that Ryan is the author of the book titled Social Contract Theory for a Diverse World. His talk today is on norm diversity and communication at scale. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Ryan, and thank you as well so much for joining us. And Ryan, you're just muted at the moment.
Thanks for that. Thank you so much for having me. I am delighted to be chatting with you all. So today, what I'm interested in is thinking about when we have diverse norms that are in conflict with each other at very large scales. So to give you a sense of what I'm up to, I will start with just setting some terms that I suspect will be familiar to most, and then emphasize some common features of norms, namely that they work really well parochially and less well as we expand outward. And then I want to think about what happens with norms that have this sort of framework as we transition towards more mass society. And I will think about mass society in kind of two ways. One is the more traditional shift from rural towards urban life. And then the more kind of current, I would say, issue of shifting between local communication networks and global communication networks. I want to suggest that this second transition to mass society looks structurally importantly different from the first urban transition. And this gives us some concerns with kind of ongoing norm conflicts that might be unproductive. And then what I want to do is try to use some of the tools of political philosophy to think about where we might have some grips on resolving some of these norms conflicts at this larger scale. So just to kind of lay out the framework, I'm relying on Christina Bicchieri's account of social norms. And so to just quickly give you the key features of that I'll be relying on here is that I'm conceiving of a norm as a behavioral rule R that's relevant for some context C for some given reference network of individuals G. An agent A in G prefers to follow that rule R in the context C, conditional on two things. First, the agent believes that enough people in that reference network follow the rule in the particular context. And then second, the agent believes that enough people in the reference network expect A to also follow R in the relevant context, and then potentially can sanction positively or negatively to support this rule following behavior. So I am just relying on the kind of classic Bicchieri account here. And what I want to do is think through some of the consequences that fall out from this basic framework. So to kind of give you a sense of where I'm going as we shift from smaller scale to larger scales, the thing that I think is useful to consider is cases where agents in some reference network have a clear understanding of the rule. Everyone agrees on what the rule looks like, but it's either the case that they have a fuzzy understanding of the full extension of the set of cases that the context governs, or that they are kind of acting entrepreneurially to expand this set. So think of something like, I see people driving on the right-hand side of the road. I think that I think that already covers people walking on the right-hand side of the sidewalk, or I think it ought to govern that. So I'm going to behave as if this rule covers that additional context. So I'm just thinking of all the different kinds of cases that this rule is supposed to work for. And either we have a kind of fuzzy penumbra of where the edges of those cases are, or that I'm looking to push that set outward. And then likewise, the other way we can be less certain of a rule that we think is quite clear, we can either have a fuzzy understanding of the full extension of the set of agents that are in G, or I'm trying to expand this set outward. So I'm trying to put people under jurisdiction of this rule in the appropriate context. So my kind of primary, or the thing that got me interested in this in the first place is that in parochial settings, R, G, and C are often quite clear and quite stable, but this is not true in more mass society settings. Even when we can have a very clear R, a very legible rule, we're going to be less able to be certain of what's going on with the extension of C and the extension of G, especially if we're in something like a competitive environment where we might have people that are aiming to increase the scope of C and G. So I think we can readily understand norms as parochial in at least two senses. So first, there's kind of mountains of empirical evidence that suggest that norms that have a smaller and more regularly interacting reference network are simply more efficacious. That is, we care a lot about what our friends and neighbors think, or our close colleagues, or something like that, in other kinds of contexts. We care less about what everyone in our city thinks or what everyone in our country thinks. We care even less about what everyone in our all humanity thinks, or something like this, if we're thinking about what social expectations we're trying to track. And this is just for kind of boring, obvious reasons. Namely, there's certain kinds of relationships that are more important to us. We care what certain people think of us. We don't care about what other people think of us. And as an aside from that, those people are also just a lot better positioned to effectively monitor our behavior. Those people with whom we have closer ties, at least within some particular context, they're seeing what we do, we can see what they do, and we're able to maintain social expectations, and they're in a position to enforce norms. So this first sense in which I think norms are parochial is just that we care more about close connections. We're more able to monitor those close connections. And so a norm that exists in that setting is reinforced regularly, and people will adhere to it. A semi-corollary of that initial version of being parochial is that there's just a whole lot more norms in small-scale settings. So in small towns, in small villages, amongst narrowly defined friend groups that are somewhat isolated, you just get more rules. There's a kind of a richer norms life because it's easier for norms to persist. And also in smaller groups, there's tend to be greater sense of shared values and shared traits, making it easier for common rules to emerge in the first place and then get stabilized by systems of social expectations. So in these parochial settings, we have improved norm persistence, and that is just going to lead to the accumulation of a lot of norms. The thing that goes with this, of course, is that norms are frequently contingent. I think from a theoretical sort of framework thinking about norm dynamics, this is fairly straightforward to establish. So if you're imagining norms function as something like a local matching model, where your primary interests are kind of matching or collaborating or coordinating with your local interactors, the many versions of local matching models all share common large-scale features. Namely, we get patches of local conformity in a larger sea of global diversity. That is, there's lots of different ways to coordinate with people locally. And if there's a wide enough option set, we see a whole lot of global variety, even if there's local homogeneity. And if you kind of adhere to the Bechieri theory of norms, it, as a framework, kind of is a rejection of functionalist norms. So we're going to have a whole bunch of norms that aren't functional or do not emerge for functional sorts of reasons. So that's just going to give us a lot of different ways that we can have norms that cover a whole bunch of different possible rules of behavior that are in some sense not strictly necessary. And so when you have this very large possibility space for rule making and this local matching sort of approach or local coordination sort of approach, we should expect a lot of regional variation across areas of an interaction system, where we have lots of different forms of local coordination. And of course, if you just look around with your eyes, you see this all the time. Right, there's lots of different forms of, say, greetings. There's lots of different kinds of rules of etiquette. There are lots of things that are social norms in some places and are just simply not rule governed in other kinds of places. And, over the course of your lifetime, you can see new kinds of norms emerge and kind of grow outward. So a couple examples of things like this that have kind of gone from not really a practice to becoming something like a rules governed practice is in at least some sub-communities, like making your pronouns explicit up front in greetings or in more formal settings. Doing something like a land acknowledgement is becoming something that has the kind of hallmarks of a social norm for some groups. Wearing a flag pin on your lapel if you're a politician. That's a thing that didn't used to exist, but has spread fairly rapidly. So we can see a bunch of cases where we're going to get divergence on what's even a rule-governed behavior in the first place. And then if it is a rule-governed behavior, where we have something like a social norm present, what's the thing selected as the rule? So what this gives us so far, and again, this should be kind of familiar to most, prior to any transition towards something like mass society, we should expect to find a social norm landscape to be patchy in the sense that there's lots of local clustering on norms. It should be rather diverse in the sense that globally, there should be a whole lot of different sorts of norms that are not replicated at the local level. And in those kind of areas of behavior where we don't expect to find functional reasons for a norm to emerge, we may see even different ways of carving up context space. That is, how we define and bracket different C's for that definition of the social norm. The idea here is simply that nature doesn't provide us with a universal categorization of behavioral types. We do that for ourselves, and that can be contingent to the structure of our local interactions for how we go about carving up that precise space. So Bicchieri gives us a bit of a framework for talking about this in terms of script and schema that help arrange what things are in what kinds of contexts. But there's no reason to expect that this is going to be identical across different areas of interactors. So if we put those two things together, this should mean that norms are likely to be different in different places, but norms are also going to be developing in what I would think of as something like different norm ecosystems, such that they aren't mere substitutes for each other. We can't just drop one norm and place it in another location, because the way in which those different ecosystems have carved up different kind of slots for contexts for behavioral rules could very well look different. So we don't have strict substitutes amongst rules. So one of the things that got me really interested in this topic was when I was at Penn a number of years ago doing some work in norms and development, and noticing that a lot of advances in, say, human rights achievement happens from a transition from rural to urban life. And this happens for a few different reasons, but a really important reason, at least on my reading of the data, is that the rural to urban transition is one that is characterized by massive reduction in norms. When you move from a very tightly knit community, you go from an environment where there's a whole lot of, though not perfect, agreement over sets of values, but you also have a whole lot of monitoring capacity for the expressions of those values in terms of norm adherence. And so one big thing that happens in this transition towards much larger sets of populations is that we just lose a lot of norms in the transition. And this is for kind of two reasons. First, there's just a process of shedding norms because we can't possibly monitor enough to maintain social expectations. We just don't have the same kinds of interactions in a large population center as we do in a small population center, where it's just more likely that we're encountering people that fit in roles rather than the same individuals. So we can't kind of track performance through time or monitor people's behavior or set expectations in quite the same way that we can when we're having regular interactions with the same people. So, Karl Popper describes this transition to the mass society as one of abstraction, where what we're doing is we're instead of living within a web of particularized interactions, we're investing in kind of like procedural systems of interaction where we don't have the kind of the same stuff. We're thinking at a more abstract level of kind of interfaces as opposed to direct contact. So that makes a whole bunch of norms trickier. The other thing that happens, I think, really importantly in a transition to mass society is that we're much more likely to find, though it's not a guarantee, an emergence of a different sort of norm, namely tolerance and forbearance. So forbearance here I'm understanding as not doing something that you could, that you're either entitled to in some way or you're licensed to do. You can exercise forbearance by not doing something that is within your rights. And then tolerance is kind of its close cousin, where tolerance is not intervening against something that you dislike when you have the means to do so. So it might not be that you have clear license or a right over this, but what tolerance involves is kind of letting others be when you could do something about it. So, accepting a different religious practice and not trying to use the power of the state to smush it is the primary example or for the emergence of tolerant sort of behaviors. But we can think more generally of just letting other values exist and expressions of those values exist, even if you dislike them, and you would have some means to disrupt it. So tolerance and forbearance typically go hand in hand with more populous and diverse environments. And as I'll talk about later, usually there are some kind of structural reasons to encourage those norms to emerge or some benefit from doing so, not merely a strict cost of taking on the kind of forbearing against intervening against something you don't like, or putting up with stuff that you dislike that is some kind of a cost to you. But there's usually a reason to take it on. So the kind of shedding and a way that tolerance norms can get off the ground is that monitoring of stricter prohibitory norms is often very difficult, right? We can't monitor in a mass society in the same way that we can monitor in a parochial one. There's not as many people watching what you do and keeping track and having a gossip network or something like that to keep you in check. Or at least not one where you couldn't simply sidestep that gossip network and go to some other group within a dense urban environment. So for that reason, social expectations are just much more difficult to establish in these kinds of environments. And the interactions are less structured to kind of give you a richer sense of whether you have accurate estimates of rule following behavior and expectations of monitoring from others. So that's the kind of normal rural to urban sort of mass transition. I think there's a second sort of mass transition where we're shifting towards an increasingly abstracted society, and that is with global communication networks. And in particular here, I'm thinking about things like social media sorts of global communication, where you're interacting with strangers a lot, where you at least have the capacity to interact with a whole lot of strangers. And this is a little different even from an urban setting, because your interactions on social media and other platforms of that sort are much more abstracted than even just visiting a random coffee shop or a retail outlet or whatever in an urban setting, where there's still a whole bunch of contextual cues. Being in person delivers. You can rely a lot more on body language and the contextual cues of the others that are around you. All that's stripped out in a kind of text-only sort of setting. And then in these kind of global communication networks, you just have a vastly larger interaction group, right? So your capacity for interaction on, say, Twitter or TikTok or whatever is just so much bigger than what you would hope to achieve in even a rather dense city. And so structurally, this appears distinct. But it's not just a matter of sheer scale. Because the other thing that's really striking is when you go from a rural to urban environment, we lose a lot of monitoring capacity. But going from local communication to kind of network communication, your capacity for monitoring is vastly increased. Namely, on Twitter, I can see someone's full posting history and what they like and what they've retweeted and all that kind of stuff, even if I was never on Twitter for those periods of time they were doing it. I get to see, by default anyway, this very extensive history of someone's behavior. I can easily discover violations of a rule if I'm searching for violations of a rule in a way that I just can't in a normal in-person set of interactions, right? This gives me kind of a perfect memory of all the times someone has complied or failed to comply with a rule in a particular kind of context, if that rule is applicable in this setting. So also because of this, and this is perhaps a bit of a feature of our psychology compared to what like a perfect computer might be able to do, it's very easy for us to get a skewed sense of the size of our reference network if we're using something like Twitter, in part because we're not getting an unfiltered access to people's behaviors on these communication networks. My evidence gathering when I'm trying to set my social expectations is mediated by algorithms that have, financial incentive in showing me friends and foes. So I can either find more rule breakers or more punishers of rule breakers more easily than I will be able to otherwise. And I'm not getting kind of a random sample. I'm getting a very skewed sample. And the way I interpret that sample might not recognize the skew of the sampling process. So what happens to social norms or the kind of structure of social norms in this transition towards global communication? So I was suggesting before that the initial transition towards urbanization to and that form of mass society makes a lot of norms much more difficult to maintain because of this reduction in monitoring capacity, the increased opportunity for new interactors, and the difficulty, therefore, of kind of getting social expectations set and reinforced. However, the second transition, I think, does a lot of work to highlight norms and norm conflict in a way that is distinct from what goes on with urbanization. So it becomes really, really easy to see a great deal of outward compliance with whatever your favorite norm in a particular context might be. But it also becomes easy to see norm violations in that sort of context, in part because the people that you're encountering in this space are either outside of your reference network properly understood, without you knowing that they are outside of your reference network, with it being unclear, or you're finding people who disagree about the extension of context C for the applicability of the behavioral rule R. And so you may be identifying norm violations when the person who is seemingly violating the rule does not perceive the norm to be operant under the conditions that they're in. And so this mismatch can generate punishment behaviors. But we can kind of add this with some features of the communication structure that makes this particularly difficult to deal with. In particular, the forms of punishment that we see on things like Twitter are extremely cheap, in the sense that, you know, quote tweeting someone or piling on a quick comment to attack someone is very inexpensive to you. It's a couple seconds of your time. There's no real trade-off there. But more importantly, it is extremely hard to coordinate with a vast sea of abstract others to coordinate the proportionality of your response to a perceived norm violation. So in person, it's fairly easy to know when the crowd is going too far, and for people to kind of get a sense of that and stop. They can see the effects of their behavior. But in a more abstracted environment, you don't have some of those more natural breaks that you might have on punishment. If anything, the larger the punishment response, the easier it is to be just one more person doing it. So this structure is going to favor lots of punishment. So what are consequences of this kind of environment? So first, and this I think is the kind of paradox of this environment, conflicting norms can each gain adherence with this sort of setting, unlike I think an urban setting. So insofar as monitoring capacity and salient punishment helps stabilize a norm as a rule of behavior that have social expectations around compliance. Well, that's what this communication environment is good at: capacity for monitoring and effective punishment. You should see that happen. Additionally, when you see another competitor norm that's looking to have an alternative rule governing some overlap of your C, this can foster more aggressive monitoring and punishment, precisely because you want your norm to remain in play and not have social expectations weaken towards favoring the other potential rule of behavior. So these conflicting norms can help drive out the extension of the set C, of the context for which the norm applies. for your reference network just because you're boundary policing so aggressively, you have reason to give yourself extra room on if you were a kind of guardian of this norm, if you're engaged in punishment behaviors to support this norm. So if you have a very large total population, there'll be enough people to visibly support a number of norms for people to sustain their social expectations. So this is an environment where you're going to have aggressive norm enforcement behaviors that perversely increases the stability of multiple norms in a population, unlike other environments where there's going to be a stricter trade-off between holding a norm or just eliminating norms altogether. So this suggests an environment of sustained conflictual punishment, where you attack your opponents and they attack you, and the process of punishment reinforces your interest in supporting your side. So I think this gives rise to, or this kind of obviates some structural challenges. So this urban to rural, rural to urban transition involves a great deal of norm shedding, not because people become more enlightened citizens or they become, more virtuous or less invested in punishment, but just for kind of bare structural reasons of the kinds of interactions that you have in this environment. You lose your capacity to monitor, you have unsettled social expectations. And then what I think is interesting about cities in particular, you have strong economic incentives to make this transition work, right? The reason why you're moving to the city in the first place is that urban productivity is so massively higher than rural productivity. You have a pretty large carrot to figure out how to navigate this more complex environment. In a global communication transition, we see a lot of norm conflict for just different structural reasons. And I don't think it's because people are worse, but rather the structure of interaction is less amenable to better behaviors. In particular, we've increased this monitoring capacity. We potentially falsely are able to maintain our social expectations because we're getting a kind of a skewed sample of people's behaviors based on the kind of intermediary mechanisms of providing us with our media feed. And then there's weak to potentially negative economic incentives for conflict reduction, right? So various social networks have an incentive to show you stuff that make you want to stay on the website longer or on the app longer. Usually that means making you have some stronger emotional reactions. So that means showing friends punish or show stuff that you feel like you should punish. Conflict draws attention. And if you're going after, say, increased visibility or cloud on the communication network, being conflictual is good for you, right? It gives you more of the thing that you want. Unlike being conflictual in a setting where we're supposed to figure out a way of working together, being conflictual makes people want to work with you less. So here's where I'm interested in trying to think through whether there are tools within liberalism to help us look at options for kind of making the second transition of mass society look more like the first. So, liberalism wasn't developed in the armchair, but was rather a set of tools developed to deal with intractable conflicts. And in particular, tolerance and forbearance were developed as kind of principles of liberal governance that served to shift us away from pretty bloody conflicts over religion in general toward the possibility of peaceful coexistence. And in the initial incarnation of these liberal principles, they were governing the exercise of power for governments in particular by constraining the domain of kind of legitimate governance. So instead of using the government to convert people into your religion, and attempting to dominate people until they dominate you by taking over the government and forcing to convert you into their religion, we simply agree we won't do that anymore. We'll say that's not a legitimate use of government authority, and limit the way in which the legitimate exercise of authority can extend over some matters of conscience and things like this. So we have a slightly different case here, though, because it's not kind of Twitter doing the punishing, or Facebook doing the punishing. It's them creating the sandbox with which we punish each other, not via kind of government authority, but via kind of private tyranny of the majority, or tyranny of the loud faction. So we might instead want to think about other liberal work that has been done around the notion of faction itself. So James Madison spent a while in Federalist Paper number 10 thinking about faction. So this is in the context of the US trying to decide if we ought to ban political parties, or merely just not kind of bake them into the structure of the government. And James Madison argued that this is impossible in a liberal regime. The idea is it's not that we can get rid of faction and have everyone work towards a common interest. We're going to necessarily have factions just because of some combination of human moral psychology and liberal freedoms in which we can exercise the rights of conscience and association, where obviously we're going to find like-minded people who share certain kinds of values with us and want to promote those values to others, and think through how we can promote those values in a variety of ways. Madison's thought here was, well, what we can do is, instead of kind of setting the stage for a particular faction to come to dominate the others, we'll make it very, very difficult for a faction to dominate. And so, according to Madison, the way to do this is, instead of having a very small country the way that Thomas Jefferson was interested in, we should have a very large country. If we have a very large country, well, what that does for us is it will increase the number of factions. The bigger the country we have, and we just turn the crank on human psychology and liberal freedoms, the more associations that will arise, and they'll all kind of low-grade fight with each other, and none of them will be able to come to dominate the others. And then there is some hope that the way in which they engage in those fights with each other is toned down, because there's no hope of victory, in the sense of your faction can't come to dominate the others because there's just too many others. And so knowing that you're always going to be in some kind of a minority gives you reason to make sure that the terms on which you're fighting are terms that are favorable to you being in a minority. So the process of everyone keeping each other in check, one ensures no one comes to dominate, but because no one can possibly come to dominate, it changes the tenor of the fight. So with the Madisonian sort of view, and with the kind of we'll call it Lockean sort of toleration sort of view, very often what's lurking in the background is some sort of carrot of liberalism. Namely, liberal theory makes these demands of you that you don't go for victory, you don't go for your faction winning, and it's that is a substantial cost. People really want other people's lives to be oriented around the values that they think are important. They want society to be ordered according to the things they think is, the best for everybody. And so the compromise that liberalism gives us is, while you're allowed to kind of promote the things that you think are valuable, you can't force it on others, and you can't dominate your opponents and wield power to win the debate through kind of force of arms or political force instead of the force of reason. So what you have to do is tolerate. You have to forbear somehow. You have to tone down your fight. But liberal theories give you something in return for that in general. So as you increase the scope of cooperation, you generate more social surplus, you make everyone richer, you enable more scientific production, all kinds of stuff. Competitive systems of governments and markets for speech and normal commodities markets help better ideas bubble up, right? We benefit from structuring these fights in terms of positive sum cooperation. And then cross-cutting institutional competition fosters more rights protections, right? By having a lot of people disagree about how to best form associations or best promote the good life and things like that, what you do is you pit greater forces than yourself against each other, which then carves out more room for you. What I suggest is we've totally failed to structure communication networks in any way that resembles this. There's no carrots for tolerance or forbearance. And what's even most damning, I think, is that we can't see it when people are tolerating or forbearing. We can only really see punishment behaviors. So we don't have a good sense of how often someone sees someone behaving poorly according to your own lights, and then letting them be. You only see people attacking them or backing them up, arguing that what they did is good. And so because we can't see this, it makes establishing norms of tolerance and forbearance nearly impossible because we can't possibly get social expectations up and running. We can't see other people doing this, and we can't get a sense that this could be both statistically normal and normatively desirable, that other people would like you to behave this way. And then kind of an awkward related thing to the notion of faction in Federalist 10 is that we have Madison's proliferation of factions, but we lack Madison's goal of the feeling of futility and total victory. We have incomplete information about our factions because it can appear to us that our faction has a potential to dominate. And because it can feel like our faction has potential to dominate, it gives us reason to go for total victory. It gives us reason to accelerate the use of punishment strategies as opposed to forbear and tolerate others. So I think this gives us sort of three sets of tools, and this is where I'll kind of leave it and bring out time for questions. So first is finding kind of structural ways of developing carrots for tolerance in these mass communication societies, interaction structures. So, whether it's granting greater exposure to those that demonstrate this sort of behavior, or some other way of fostering a notion of social surplus to be extended to those that exhibit behaviors that allow others who they disagree with to peaceably coexist. That's one kind of structure that would involve kind of adjusting information presentation at scale. So it's not stuff that kind of we see or that we as agents in the system do so much as restructuring the environment in which we're engaging with each other. The other element here is finding ways of making forbearance visible. If you post an opinion that someone doesn't like on Twitter, let's say, and you get 1,000 people very upset with you, that can feel quite overwhelming, but it might be the case that it's 1,000 of like the 3 million that saw. And for that reason, that's, a pittance of people are upset with you. It doesn't quite feel that way, but finding a way of converting those ratios into something that's more easily experienced by the users facilitates the extension of those behaviors and can facilitate kind of punishment of the violation of forbearance. So the last element of this that is sort of under making forbearance visible is developing ways of setting boundaries of norms. So I think the most interesting instance of this is thinking about how to determine whether someone's in your reference network or not. So in a whole bunch of settings in your life, this is very clear, right? You have pretty well-defined friendship groups. You have pretty well-defined professional groups. You have pretty well-defined neighborhoods in physical neighborhoods, or other kind of associational things like other parents at your kid's school, things like that. Like that's a fairly well-defined reference structure. But in a more abstracted society, in a communication structure that lacks kind of clear in or out cues for your reference network, this becomes more difficult. So one option is increasing the federational structure of a social media platform. So it's clear in virtue of opting in to a particular kind of federated group who wants to be bound by certain norms and not others, where we can kind of opt in to more explicit sets of rules. Alternatively, some way of kind of like indicating in your profile how you take yourself to be wanting to be monitored and governed. And then lastly, some capacity for understanding whether we have a shared understanding of C or not. And I think this is rather difficult. Some way of determining whether this is like a novel extension of the rule or whether this is natural. So the way, this often gets played out in a parochial environment, people make similarity judgments and have to offer reasons for why we ought to extend. And so whether there's some opportunity for kind of adjudicating the extension of rules is an interesting, to me, way of extending this that feels more like how we interact in normal life. So, okay, I will stop it there and we'd be delighted to take your questions. Thanks so much.
Excellent, great. Thank you so much, Ryan, for that. And as we turn it over to questions, just want to note to everyone that feel free to also raise your hand at any point. And maybe we can start by going to a few questions in the chat. Ryan, before we turn to questions for you, there was one remaining question for Ahra. And maybe Ahra, to respond to this. For most of the questions you already responded, but there was one question from Zarima in which they asked, how are these preferences changes in accordance to various decisions? So maybe Ahra, if you want to touch on that, that would be great.
Yeah, I briefly talked about while I was answering toward Hades' question. So even though I didn't have a lot of time to really talk about additional studies that we reported in the paper, we also measure about what kind of social motivations are prioritized and valued for different types of psychological well-being. For example, we ask for your hedonic well-being, what kind of goals are more important, more or less important, or your daimonic well-being and self-actualizations. That's actually one of the way we kind of deal with this social desirability bias. We found that for the self-actualization, people really value the status motivation, not at all family motivation, not at all mate seeking, or mate retention. Hedonic, on the other hand, people really value mate seeking. So finding and attracting romantic sexual relationship was very important for their hedonic well-being. So definitely this valuation and prioritization of the social goal really depends on the various decision, maybe life stages, and what they are really thinking of for the questions. And I think that's really helped me understand that the main finding and the main argument that I want to talk about is not just the family important for no matter what kind of context, psychological situation. It's more like in general, relative to the how much we spend time on learning social psychological behavior in social psychology, family motivation have been like a little bit neglected in terms of research.
Great. Thank you so much for clarifying, Ahra. I really appreciate it. Ryan, there's a couple of questions for you in the chat. The first one of which is, do you differentiate between signaling identity with certain groups, for example, the flag pins, versus an expression of a norm?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think these are a little bit hard to pull apart in this sort of context for two reasons. So first, we can imagine these are operating as something like a shibboleth for group identification. But then we do see, for instance, with flag pins, that people get hectored over not wearing one. And this is not a, oh, now I know you're not in my group, and so you're not signaling that way. But like the beginning of Obama's first campaign, he didn't wear a flag pin and got attacked a whole lot until he just started wearing a flag pin all the time. And so that wasn't, oh, well, now we know he's outside of the group. It was, you're supposed to be a member of this group and you're failing to adhere to the rule that we've established. And that was a rule that, was fairly new. That was a post 9/11 kind of phenomenon. But now we see it kind of continue to persist. So but the more abstract idea here is, insofar as rules are for a context and a group, we can either say you're not in our group and we're going to punish you for failing to be in our group, or we're trying to get you into our group, and so we're going to harangue you until you conform with the rules of the group. And so these are, I think, very tricky to pull apart. And often when we see this sort of punishment behavior, you can imagine both kinds of motives operating amongst the punishers. One is just, I'm punishing the out member. And the other is, I'm trying to extend my group outwards and the norm outwards.
Gotcha. Thanks, Ryan, for that. I see a couple more questions in the chat, or two more questions. And also thank you, Heidi, for putting in these questions. And in the meantime, as I'm going through this, folks, please feel free to raise your hand if you'd like. Actually, yeah, let's turn to you, Diego, and then let's go to these questions in the chat. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Samira. Thank you, Ryan. Great presentation. I enjoyed it a lot. So one question, when you're talking about tolerance and trying to shift to not going for total victory,
yeah,
perhaps in extended online communities and social media, it seems that the mood is not so much going for total victory, but the fear of avoiding total defeat, right? We hear, we're in this culture war, the other side is winning, we must avoid losing, this war. So it seems that the framing is, at least how I perceive it, seems to be more of avoiding total defeat than going for total victory. If that's the case, how would that change the sort of the propositions you make?
Great question. And I think two similar thoughts, I suppose. So first is, I think there's a whole lot of groups that both claim that they're the minority and claim that they're going for total victory. So I think it's really easy to find even fairly niche groups arguing that what they need to do is eliminate their opponents. Opponent elimination is going for total victory, whether it's by converting them to your side or getting them out somehow or whatever it might be. The flip side of that, though, is the groups that are looking to not be defeated, and so can be aggressive to preserve the integrity of their group in whatever form. But notice that only makes sense in a context of the availability of total victory, where if you think other people are going for a complete victory, you're gonna shift your behaviors to ensure that you're taking the drastic steps necessary to preserve the thing that you have. But it also, I would bet, often enough will translate into this making you feel like if you're in a position, you get to go after them as well. So some other research that I've been doing that is empirical in nature, that looks at like a measure of people's zero-sum beliefs, so the beliefs that the world is structured around win-lose interactions as opposed to chance for positive-sum interactions. This is often structured around what expectations are when power imbalances shift, where we become pretty convinced that the people that are lower power will dominate us if they have the opportunity. And this gives us reason to dominate them in perpetuity, so we can't be dominated ourselves. But it also gives a lot of permission structure for engaging in anti-tolerant behaviors, even if you're the weaker party, just to make sure that you keep what you have.
Great, excellent. Thank you, Ryan. And hopefully, Diego, that helped clarify. Excellent. And I see two more questions. I think we can go to these last two and then wrap up the session. The second to last question, Ryan, is regarding the transition to urbanism and norms. Do you see this relating to the idea of tight versus loose societies, or do you consider them to be quite different phenomena?
I think they are heavily correlated ideas, or I think we can make them conceptually distinct, but it's hard to find a large diverse population that is also tightly organized. So a way you can think about this is you can imagine societies that are deeply coordinated within subgroups, but then have cross-cutting connections between them. We find lots of examples of this sort of thing. Then we can ask, what are the cross-group behaviors that we see? Are they punishment behaviors, or are they coordinative kind of tolerant behaviors? So there's a neat set of results looking at Indian port cities, comparing them against non-port internal cities that suggest that the availability of commerce does work to foster a reduction in interreligious violence when you have and more tolerant behaviors, where kind of out-group interactions become profitable for you instead of just a change in status competition between groups. And so I think that that's a little bit of evidence I've seen for kind of tight versus loose, even in more dense environments. But in general, density just delivers diversity at the same time and gives rise to lower monitoring levels.
Gotcha. Great. Thanks, Ryan. And then the last question for you is regarding global communication. Would you say that this has led to both reduced tolerance and reduced forbearance? And if so, would you say that this has been proportional or rather asymmetric?
So I want to be careful here, because I think that in our in at least a whole lot of our kind of in-person interactions, we don't see a reduction in tolerance for forbearance in particular. But in our kind of abstracted interactions, I think we see reductions in both, just more or less across the board. It's very, or to the extent to which there's a whole lot of tolerance for forbearance, it's hard to see for the reasons I was mentioning, right? Like that stuff is invisible to what we're presented with. And instead, we see a lot of punishment. I think the danger for spillover into real life is that in our normal interactions, it can be very hard for us to find a small group of people with a kind of strange or out of mainstream set of behaviors that we'd like to promulgate to others, where it's very easy to find that online. And having kind of extensions of your real life group where your reference network becomes part of the abstracted thing, it makes it easier to punish in real life, in kind of person-to-person interactions as well. Just because your reference network's been extended in this way, it gives you this bias sample over when punishment should be expected. And so I think that can spill over to normist interactions in a way that's bad for us.
Gotcha. Great. Thanks, Ryan. I think with that, we can start wrapping up. Let me just quickly share my screen one last time. And so this is just to say thank you, first of all, everyone, for your questions and participations in today's talk. And especially thank you to Ryan and Ahra for your really compelling presentations and contributions. We really do appreciate that you joined us and are a part of our series on the Norms in Behavioral Change Talks. Yeah, in terms of next steps, we really look forward to everyone's participation in our next Norms in Behavioral Change Talk, which will be by Dr. Sarah Constantino from Northeastern University. And this will take place on Thursday, March 14th at 1 p.m. EST. So again, thank you so much, Ryan and Ahra, for your presentations, everyone here for joining us, and we look forward to having you join us next time. Thank you, everyone.